Joining me today is award-winning journalist, author, playwright, screenwriter, co-author of the book The CIA Does Not Want You to Read, and that is Jawbreaker. He's also he's co-authored Inside SEAL Team 6, and many, many other great works such as Eve Missing, Blood of My Blood, Plunging into Haiti, and like I said, many more great titles, ladies and gentlemen. Joining me now, please join me in welcoming Ralph Pezzullo to the program. Hello, Ralph. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Bruce. Thanks
Great
for having
to have
me
you
on.
on.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
It's great to have you on, Ralph. Thank you so much. Now, being originally from New York City, how difficult is it for you to watch the footage of 9/11 as of late, regarding, the botched up operations, all these people responsible, we hear them aiding and abetting the same enemy in Syria. How difficult has it been for you to see this footage as of late?
I was actually living in New York when 9/11 happened. I was living on 111th Street, and it was a very, very painful day, shocking. I knew people who died in the tragedy, and many, many more people that were affected by it, and I can tell you that being a resident of Manhattan at that time, all of us were in shock for about 3 months. It wasn't until sort of January, 2002 that anything started to happen.
That's right.
Nobody was really doing anything. It was a very, very difficult time, horrible time.
I could imagine, Ralph. I mean, I think it's safe to say most New Yorkers have had a sick feeling in their guts this whole week. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It was just, I remember I was on my way to my office, and I went to say goodbye to my 2-year-old daughter. She was in front of the TV, and I thought she was watching Sesame Street, and I saw that there was an image, a silent image of one of the towers on fire, and I thought, what the heck is this? Is this the anniversary of the first attack on the World Trade Center?
Right.
And there was no sound, there was no commentary, and so I was looking at it, wondering why, what's going on? Why isn't she watching Sesame Street? And suddenly I heard a voice say, "Oh my God, here comes another plane!" And
wow.
I saw the second plane, strike, and that minute, that moment, I knew that our history was changing, and this was going to have an enormous impact on all of our lives, which is what has happened. Certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I can remember I was a sophomore. I was in 10th grade, and the internet was relatively new back then, and they shut down all communications. The school was on lockdown, and
wow.
I thought it was weird. I mean, I couldn't even turn on. I mean, the internet, like I said, was relatively new. I was in my math class at the time, and the teacher usually let us go online. And this time he didn't. He was like, nope, no internet, no radio, no TV, no nothing. So I thought that was weird. And then getting home, I got home and I saw what was going on, and I literally thought the world was ending. I mean, I was a young guy back then, but I thought, wow, this is it. We're finished.
Yeah. I mean, it was just, I had friends in this, sort of security section of the government, or working for the Rand Corporation and so on, who had been talking about for years how, the security of the borders was not, we were pretty lax about security, and we didn't realize that, that there was a threat that could reach American soil. And, nobody paid much attention to them. And then, 9/11 happened, and, wow, it was profound.
Absolutely.
And we're still, I think, kind of, still trying to come to terms with that in many ways.
We are. Well, Ralph, moving on, you moved to L.A. in 2004, I believe, after writing almost about almost everything, as you put it, in particular your mystery novel, Eve Missing. Tell us about that novel and what it's been like to work with Hollywood icons like Oliver Stone, one of my personal favorite. I mean, he's one of the absolute best directors ever, and Antoine Fuqua, among others.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, it's been, I started really as a journalist, and then I became interested in theater. And while I was in New York, I wrote, plays. I wrote about, 12 to 14 plays that were produced in New York and other cities around the country, and a few of them were performed overseas. And then and I had done some work for movies, and I decided in late 2003 to move my family to Los Angeles, and we fell in love with Southern California right away. It's so beautiful and so on, and around that time I wrote, as you mentioned, Eve Missing, which was a mystery novel. It's a story of a New York City policeman who is sort of wrongfully accused of a violent incident that takes place while he and his partner are breaking up a domestic dispute, and he's sort of railroaded out of the New York Police Department, and he becomes and the thing he liked about being a policeman the most was helping other people. So he decides he's going to become a private investigator, and the first case that he takes on is of a girl who has gone missing. She's a young fashion model, and he sort of delves into this world of high fashion, which he is completely foreign to him, and ends up falling in love with a woman he meets, who was kind of Eve's mentor, and then sort of halfway through he realizes that this woman had something to do with Eve's disappearance.
Wow.
And it's a pretty intense, steamy, mystery novel, and it was great for me because the mystery writing community is kind of a small fraternity, a small group, and I got to meet a lot of fellow authors and
awesome,
and make a lot of friends. And then, coming to Hollywood, I found it to be, quite receptive to new talent arriving in California. And I got a chance to work, as you mentioned, with, some really talented people, including Oliver Stone, who, wanted to make Jawbreaker, which is a book I wrote with CIA operative Gary Burnson, into a movie. And we came very close. It was, great working with him. I'm a huge fan of his movies, especially his earlier movies. And it didn't work out. Hollywood is a crazy place. Lots of lots of twists and turns, but
a lot of red tape, right?
Huge red tape. Yeah, you're dealing with a lot of people who are, making decisions. Who, I'm somebody who is, as a writer, I am just interested in the material and how to tell the story and tell the story the best way. And a lot of people out here, they could, the material to them is not important. They're not even, they don't even particularly read it. They're just interested in other things, which are, how they're going to market it and how it's going to fit into their slate of movies and so on and so forth. Things that are, important, but were not important to me. And, anyway, it didn't work out. Yeah.
Well, that's unfortunate, Ralph. I mean, I could imagine, though. I mean, Jawbreaker is definitely not their cup of tea. It wouldn't.
No. I mean, I remember turning in a draft to Paramount, and going there to get, notes. And some people said, well, gee, they don't kill Osama bin Laden at the end. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah, he got away. That's the whole point. And they're like, well, that, we're going to have to change that because, that's too much of a downer, for the end of a movie. I was like, what? What are you talking about? This is history. This is what happened. And it's a shame it wasn't made into a movie because, I think it's a very important story. And had, I tried to explain this to them at the time, and had we killed Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora, which is what the CIA and Gary, what they were trying to do, it would have been very difficult for the United States to justify going into Iraq and continuing the war in Afghanistan, the way we have. So right. I think it would have made like a big difference. And, it was an important historical moment, that was an opportunity that was missed. And had it, had they been successful, it would have changed, changed history. But, it is what it is.
That's very, very unfortunate. But, we have to keep talking about Jawbreaker. I mean, it's a book that's been very essential in my waking up. I mean, I love reading it. I mean, I feel like I'm right there in a helicopter about to deploy in Afghanistan when I'm reading it. I mean, It's a book that, like you said, you co-authored with former CIA Commander Gary Bernstein, Jawbreaker. What's Jawbreaker code for?
Jawbreaker, as you know, Bruce, what happened after 9/11, President Bush, it became obvious right away that, Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda was operating out of Afghanistan, and they were being protected they were given safe haven by the Taliban, which was in control of Afghanistan at the time. And immediately, President Bush made a statement saying, asking demanding that the Taliban, kick him out of Afghanistan or turn him over to the United States. And the Taliban said, of course, go to hell, basically. And,
piss off.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. And so the president wanted to do something to retaliate. And he went to the Defense Department and said, I want to send troops into Afghanistan. And the answer he got from the Defense Department was, well, we need 6 months to plan something because, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It's very difficult geographically. The Soviet Union's got their butts kicked there. We have to do a lot of, planning, logistical planning before we can do anything. And the president was very frustrated, and everybody in the government knew that. And a group of CIA officers came up with this idea that they took to the president, and it was basically that they had operatives in Afghanistan working with the opposition to the Taliban, which was called the Northern Alliance. There were a group of tribes organized under Commander Massoud in the north, and some CIA officers, including Gary Bernstein, had been working with these guys before. And so what the CIA proposed is that they organize a group of teams, send them into Afghanistan to just sort of work with the Northern Alliance and kind of prepare for the U.S. military to, for the U.S. military incursion into Afghanistan.
Right.
So the man that they decided they needed somebody who was, spoke the language, was familiar with Afghanistan, had a relationship with the Northern Alliance, and the man that they decided to bring in was named Gary Bernstein, who you mentioned, the gentleman that I wrote the book with. And Gary at the time was the CIA station chief in Montevideo, Uruguay. They called him up he also happened to be a New Yorker. He had been born and raised in Long Island. So they called Gary up to CIA headquarters in Langley, and said, hey, this is what we want you to do. We want you to organize a group of teams that we're going to send into Afghanistan with a small group of special forces people. And you're going to just kind of start to prepare for the U.S. Military incursion that's going to come later. And so Gary goes to work, and Gary is like a very, very aggressive type of guy.
Right.
A guy who, you ask him to do something, and he does it, no matter what it is, and no matter, how many heads he has to crack, to get it done. And so he immediately starts, scouring the government for people who were native speakers, who had some experience in Afghanistan. And interestingly, he got a lot of resistance, even though this is like weeks after 9/11. There was a lot of resistance from people in the bureaucracy, even in the CIA, guys saying, hey, we don't want you to take our officer because he's probably going to get killed anyway. And,
wow.
Who are you and what is... Anyway, he puts these teams together. And the main team was called Jawbreaker. And that was the team that he was running. And they were in the Panjshir Valley, which was just north of Kabul. And then there were about 7 other teams that were scattered across around the country, working with different pockets of tribes who were, fighting the Taliban.
Mm-hmm.
And Gary goes in. He's got a Rubbermaid trunk. I mean, one thing we should explain is that Jawbreaker was pretty heavily redacted by the U.S. government.
That's right.
So there were a lot of things we had to take out of the book. One of the things we had to take out was the fact that Gary went into Afghanistan with $11 million in cash in a Rubbermaid trunk. So he goes in, he's helicoptered in with a small group of guys. His team was about 20 people, about 10 CIA officers and 10 Special Forces guys. They go in and they start working with the Northern Alliance. And immediately Gary starts getting very aggressive. So what he does is he starts getting satellite phone numbers of the Taliban commanders, because Afghanistan, to understand Afghanistan is a tribal country, and it's a country that's ruled by warlords, and so alliances are shifting all the time.
That's right.
And Gary, being a student of Afghanistan and having been there before, he understood that. And what he did is he started getting the phone numbers of guys who were fighting for the Taliban, and he'd call them up, and he'd say, hey, Shah Muhammad, or whatever your name is, I'm Gary Bernson. I'm going to come here, and I'm coming to kick your ass. And if you don't, I'm going to give you an option. I'll give you $100,000 right now to come over to my side and fight for me. Or I'm going to call, I know your position, I'm going to call in airstrikes, and you're going to get wiped out tomorrow. And one of the things that the Special Forces brought with them were these things called SOFLAMs, which are Special Forces, I forget what the whole acronym means, but they're laser markers, and basically it's like a rifle that you could point at a target, and it emits a laser beam that you can accurately for 3 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And that once that beam fixes on a target, an aircraft or like a B-52 flying over at 30,000 feet can drop a bomb that will lock right onto that laser designator and hit that spot, directly.
Right.
So those proved to be incredibly important. And so when Gary made these threats to these commanders, they were like, okay, I'll take the $100,000
right away.
But I'll take it, man. But I've got 20 Al-Qaeda guys with me. What do I do about them? And Gary would say, I'll kill them. Just shoot them. And they'd go, okay, we'll wait for you. And Gary would say, okay, we'll wait for you at this spot at noon tomorrow. and they'd go to a certain spot in the Panjshir Valley, and they'd hear machine gun fire, which was, these guys shooting the Al-Qaeda people, and then they'd walk over the line to the other side, and they'd fight for Gary in the Northern Alliance. So what happened is that within 3 weeks, Gary had built up like such a big force, and the SOFLAMs were so effective, combined with U.S. airstrikes, that they were able to get the Taliban lines to break that were guarding Kabul, which is the capital, and they took over the capital city. And I think, Vice President Cheney was having a news conference at the time, and some reporter from CNN said, hey, did you know that Kabul has fallen and there are Americans there? And he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And they showed him some footage of a bunch of Americans getting off of a helicopter, and one of them was Gary Burnson. So nobody thought that these guys, Gary's teams, were gonna have any success. In fact, they were telling the president that they figured, they had a 50-50. There was a 50-50 chance that they'd all get killed. And but anyway, they were successful beyond anybody's imagination, and within 3 weeks they had taken over. They had kicked the Taliban out of Kabul. The Taliban had retreated south with their the people, the Al-Qaeda fighters that they had.
Right.
And then Gary wanted Osama bin Laden. He had told his superiors at the CIA before he left that he was going to come back with Osama bin Laden's head in a box. And,
wow.
Yeah, he's a pretty intense guy. And so he goes to he was working. The Northern Alliance had good intelligence sources, and they were tracking bin Laden's escape into the mountains in the southeast, which is, that area is called Tora Bora. They're called the White Mountains. And so Gary was tracking, he was seeing that Osama bin Laden was escaping there, and he wanted to send a team down to block his, to stop him.
That's right.
But the Special Forces guys who were with him, he went to them, and they were like, there's no way we're going down south because, that's Taliban territory. And the Northern Alliance tribes that Gary was fighting with, they were just happy to be in Kabul. They refused to go south. So Gary was kind of on his own. And what he did was he got another group of tribesmen, Hazara tribesmen, which was another smaller tribe, to escort a group of his guys down to Tora Bora. And they went down there, and they engaged Osama bin Laden in a battle that went on for about 12 days. And, they were able to get about 40 Delta Force guys to go down there, because what happened was when they got to Tora Bora, Gary was paying off other local tribes to fight for him. But they were very, they were not trustworthy at all. And a lot of them had worked for bin Laden, like 2 weeks prior to that, or, a month prior to that. So they had, no incentive to really go after bin Laden. But Gary they had brought 2 of those SOFLAMs with them. So they climbed up into the mountains for about 2 days to a spot where they could look directly down on bin Laden's camp. And he had a camp in the mountains with about 1,000 to 2,000 people. And they had tanks and barracks and so on. And for 36 hours straight, I think there were 4 people up there, Americans. They called in airstrikes, and they beat the hell out of bin Laden's camp. They were just, dropping bombs all over the place.
About 56 airstrikes, right? That's what I read from the CIA.
Yeah, it was intense. They were dropping bombs all the time. And one of the guys who was there was a Lebanese American former Marine, who's happened to be the guy that the CIA used when they got voice recordings of bin Laden. They would use him to identify bin Laden's voice. And he climbed down from this precipice at a certain point, and he saw that there was like a couple of dead Al-Qaeda soldiers there. And one of them was holding a walkie-talkie, a push-pull radio. And he grabbed it from the guy's hand, and he started listening, and he heard bin Laden's voice. And bin Laden was talking to his troops, basically saying, praying and saying, I don't know where these bombs are coming from. I don't know how the U.S. found us so quickly.
Wow.
And we have to retreat, up into the mountains. We got to get out of here. So right away, they knew that bin Laden was trying to retreat into Pakistan. And Gary, like I said, this battle went on for about 12 days. Gary was just screaming at Washington, constantly saying, I need U.S. Rangers to parachute into the mountains to stop bin Laden and his men from escaping into Pakistan. And the government, the military was their position was sort of like, well, who the hell is this guy? We never heard of this guy before. And how did he get there? And how come like a CIA officer is telling us what to do?
Right.
And calling in airstrikes. And finally it went to the White House. The CIA officials took it to the White House and tried to get the president to, they had a big meeting about it. And General Tommy Franks, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, he was against it. He said, well, it's very, it's 14,000 feet, and it's very treacherous terrain, and so on and so forth. And, other people were saying, 14,000 feet, like, I ski at 14,000.
Are you kidding me? I mean, come on,
what's the big deal? These are soldiers. They're trained to do that. And basically what happened was, at the time, we had this very close relationship with General Musharraf, who was the head of the president of Pakistan at the time. And he assured, Vice President Cheney that the Pakistanis would send troops, to block the border. And, what the government, what the president and the vice president didn't understand at the time was that those areas were barely under the control of the Pakistani government. They were kind of lawless tribal areas. And what happened was, bin Laden was able to pay off, actually he split his force into two sections. He had about 400 guys left. He had taken very, very serious losses in the airstrikes. And half of them were caught and picked up by the Pakistanis, and they were the guys that's why they opened Guantanamo, because they didn't know what to do with these guys. So, but bin Laden was able to, pay people off at the border and slip into Pakistan.
Wow.
So,
now,
it's a pretty amazing story.
It is. Gary was the CIA's go-to guy in Afghanistan for over 20 years. So, I mean, he's definitely a somebody. And, it seems that he's playing this game of cat and mouse with both bin Laden and the U.S. government. I mean, I read in the book that he tracked down, that wasn't the only time he tracked down bin Laden, and he was denied the use of force against bin Laden. So, I mean, and then right away when you open Jawbreaker, it looks like your second co-author is a black magic marker. Yeah.
We had a very difficult time getting the book out. Yeah, it was a tough.
Now,
a lot of things were taken out, and I mean, Gary. Yes, it's true. Gary was in Afghanistan in 2000 on a mission to kill bin Laden. And he was called out by the Clinton administration because they got cold feet. They were worried that, legally at the time, this is before the Patriot Act had been passed, and President Clinton's lawyers basically said, legally we don't have the right, to go into this country and kill this guy. And so Gary and the people who were with him, they tried to go ahead. They were planning to go ahead with the mission anyway because they were there and they were ready to launch it. So they lied to the government and they were saying, well, we can't leave because the weather is bad. And finally they caught on and they were like, hey, look, we're looking at the satellite photos and there's no bad weather in Afghanistan. So, you guys have to get out of there. But this happened, Bruce, this is an interesting thing. This happens a lot in the government. There's a lot of times there's a big disconnect between what people how people in Washington perceive something and how people on the ground perceive something. A lot of times the people on the ground are way, way ahead of the political leaders, and they're going, this isn't going to work, or, hey, this is easy, just give us the go-ahead and we can take care of this. And people in Washington are sitting around, debating, like, what the consequences are going to be or if the time is right and all that. And so a lot of times it's very frustrating for people on the ground. I mean, I know a lot of, CIA and military people who have been serving in Afghanistan for the last, 3 or 4 years, and many of them have described, a situation there that is, really bad. And yet, if you listen to the president or the Secretary of State or other government officials, it makes it sound as though, we're succeeding in Afghanistan, and that is absolutely the opposite. It's not going well at all.
Absolutely. I mean, we should have learned from the Soviets how that is an impossible battle to win in that terrain.
Absolutely.
That's their home. That's their home court. And going back,
it's their home court. Yeah, yeah. And also, it's as I mentioned before, Afghanistan is a tribal country. All the alliances are tribal. It's not about politics. So basically, the government, the Karzai government, even though Karzai is the big tribe in Afghanistan are the Pashtuns. That's the majority tribe, and they control most of the south of the country. In the north, there are a bunch of other tribes, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazaris, but they're much smaller. And the government that is in power now is really the government that, the tribes that we helped install, when Gary helped the Northern Alliance overtake Kabul. And so basically, even though it's not described that way by our political leaders, we have taken sides, in a tribal fight. So, and we've taken sides, with the lesser, side. The Pashtun tribe, dominates Pakistan and always has. And, we call them Taliban. Well, Taliban is sort of their radical kind of political military arm, but they represent the Pashtun tribe, and the government that we're fighting for, that we're aiding, it represents the Northern Alliance the Northern tribes. And
unbelievable.
And, yeah, and it's just not gonna. It was kind of a flawed, idea from the beginning, and
wow.
And the idea that the Pashtuns are more Islamic than the Northern Alliance is also, flawed. Afghanistan is not as, as religious, I would say, fundamentally religious country as, a lot of the other Muslim countries in the area. So it's the whole thing has kind of, been misconstrued,
right.
Not explained well to the American people. And sometimes I wonder if if government officials themselves understand, the country, because a lot of them don't.
Wow. Now, Ralph, it took about 40 days, right, for the agency to get their black markers all over the book. What information is the government so afraid of in this publication that Gary had to sue the CIA?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's an interesting story because what happened was when Gary approached me about writing this book, which was in it was like about a year before the book came out. So the book came out in December of 2005, and he approached me in like maybe September of 2004. And he told me this incredible, that he would have been involved. Actually, when I met him, he had been involved in another like really spectacular operation in Japan, and he wanted to write a book about that. And I said, yeah, great, man. I'd love to work with you. And I was walking with him to the train to get back on the train to go back to Washington. We met in New York. And he said, yeah, after we write that book, I was the guy who was sent into Afghanistan after 9/11, and I had, bin Laden trapped up in Tora Bora. And I grabbed him and, like, pulled him off the train, and I was like, what? Tell me about that. And he told me the story, and I said, hey, Gary, that's the book we have to write. And it took me a couple of weeks to convince him, and he said, okay, let's do it. And I knew that when we went to sell the book to publishers, that all of them would say, are you going to be allowed to write this book? Because at the time, Gary was still in the CIA.
Right.
So and he was planning to stay in the CIA. So Gary said, okay, I raised this with Gary, and Gary said, okay, Ralph, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to write up a memo, and I'm going to tell them that I'm writing a book with you about this subject. He said, because from the CIA point of view, like this is a good story, and I think the guys, the people that I'm working with will allow me to write this book. And and you're like a, well-regarded, balanced writer and so on and so forth. So anyway, he wrote a memo, and they signed off on it. So when we went into publishers in New York and said, hey, we want to write this book about this subject, and they said, well, will the CIA allow you to write this book? We'd pull out the memo, and then they'd go, oh, great, you've already taken care of this. So we signed the contract. I started working on the book, and I finished it. And just about the time when I finished it, because any book that's written by a former or current CIA officer has to be, they all sign a contract where anything they write during their lifetime about their activities has to be reviewed by. They have an office at the CIA. It's called the Publications Review Board.
Uh-huh.
So Gary and I were just about ready to submit the manuscript to the Publications Review Board, and Gary called me and he said, Ralph, we might have a problem. There's been a change in the leadership here, and the new director is really against like any books coming out because he felt there's been too much information coming out about the CIA.
Right.
And I was like, well, where does that leave us? And he said, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and submit it to the PRB. So we submitted it, and they came back to us right away, and they were like, hey, man, this is a great book. We don't really see too many problems here. And we were like, great. And we were expecting it back, and this was like, say, May of 2005. The book was supposed to be published in, I think, like 1st of September. And what happened was it kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And every week Gary would call the Publications Review Board and say, like, what's going on? And they'd go, we really don't know. We did our work and we didn't find any problems in it, but the guys upstairs are holding it up.
Amazing.
And Gary finally spoke to some of the guys upstairs, and they said, well, it's really being held up by the White House. So Gary had a friend. He knew a guy in the White House, and he called his friend at the White House, and his friend said, Gary, forget about this book. It's never going to come out. And at that point, that's when Gary is like a very pugnacious type of guy. He basically said, you know what, Ralph, screw these guys. I'm going to quit, and I'm going to sue them because I want this story to come out. And he did that.
Amazing.
And he won the suit. It took a while, but we won. And the woman the judge was a Republican, so we were kind of nervous about that. And the book finally came out in December, right after Christmas of 2005. But they still, it was like a kind of a battle. Like every time, the first time they gave us the manuscript back, it was like Swiss cheese. I mean, there was no book left. They took out so much information. So I had to go through and kind of justify like everything that they had taken out and talk, like write up a little memo about, this passage has been mentioned before, because they have certain guidelines, and they had violated all of their guidelines. And basically, and then by like November, we got the book back again, and the publisher was just basically like, we're exhausted. Either we publish the book this way, or forget it.
So it was an uphill battle from the start. It
was an uphill battle. That's right, Bruce.
And I'm sorry, but what I take away from this, Ralph, is that the CIA, the president, actually the White House, like you mentioned, it definitely seems like they were protecting the bin Laden family. I mean, after bombing the American embassies that bin Laden was a part of, the attack on the USS Cole, bin Laden even received dialysis treatment at a U.S. embassy in Dubai 2 months before 9/11. So, all these chances that Gary had to kill bin Laden, and he was denied. Okay, he was denied the ability to bag bin Laden. It's just incredible how instead of sending a death blow to our enemies, we are still, to this day, we see it happening in Syria. We continue to aid and abet them.
Yeah, well, Bruce, a lot of times it's ignorance and it's incompetence.
Amazing.
There's a lot of, Syria is another example. There's just a lot of, it's a very difficult situation.
Slippery slope.
It's a slippery slope. And the president, there was never a strategy. This war has been going on for 2 years. You can go back to the Arab Spring. Here were all of these countries that were fighting. The populace was rising up against sort of the political repression in their countries, and we were encouraging it. The president made statements about this is a great thing, and this is a democratic movement and an expression of people seizing wanting power back and overthrowing repressive regimes, and they overthrew Mubarak in Egypt, who had been the military dictator for like 40 years, and they elected a president. Right, they had democratic elections, and they elected a president, Morsi, who was from the Muslim Brotherhood. He wasn't he wasn't somebody that we particularly liked, but the Egyptian people elected this guy, right?
Right.
And then he was overthrown by the Egyptian military a couple months ago, and our government still refuses to call it a coup d'état.
Exactly.
Which is what it was. And
absolutely.
Even though we didn't like Morsi, democracy is like a messy thing. We elect all kinds of crazy presidents.
Right.
We don't always elect the best person or the person somebody else likes, but that's the way it works. And
Ralph, we're running short on time. We got about 2 minutes left. Literally, I want to talk to you about so much. You got so many great books. Plunging into Haiti. Eve Missing, Most Evil, the U.S. Navy SEAL Survival Handbook, one of the I mean, you wrote another book with Gary. I mean, The Walk-In. I mean, I can talk to you for hours, but I don't have the time, unfortunately. But real quick, I mean, you were in Saigon during the Gulf of Tonkin, or better said, the lack thereof Gulf of Tonkin incident. Tell us, what are some of the
kid. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
What are some of the most interesting places that you've traveled, and tell us about your book, At the Fall of Somoza.
Well, my father was a U.S. diplomat. When he grew up in the Bronx, he was a high school teacher, and then he joined the Foreign Service. And he was a career diplomat. And towards the end of his career, he was named ambassador to Uruguay in the 70s. And then when the Nicaraguan Revolution started in Nicaragua, which was the summer of 1979, the Carter administration asked him to go to Nicaragua and talk to the president there, who was Anastasio Somoza. His family had been in power for 40 years, and try to convince him to negotiate with him to leave Nicaragua. And my father was sent into the middle of like a civil war in Nicaragua and spent two weeks with Somoza in his bunker, trying to convince him to leave. And Somoza, who had attended West Point and was like, part American really, and had all kinds of friends in the U.S. Senate and in Congress, he was basically, and he was drunk and on drugs and in, really bad shape, and basically arguing with my father and going, how can you do this to me? I've been a friend of the United States all these years. I've been an anti-communist. I voted whenever you told me to vote a certain way in the UN, or when you needed bases for the Bay of Pigs, I supplied you with bases. And now in my time of need, when, the people are rising up against me, you won't help me? You're telling me to leave?
Amazing.
And so they had this, it was almost like a Greek tragedy, in a way. They had this fascinating sort of back and forth that went on for like 2 weeks while the country was burning. And it's a really interesting book. But
Amazing.
just because of my father and the way I grew up, I've been, exposed and grew up around all these sort of foreign escapades and crises that the U.S. government has been involved in. And what I can tell you, just sort of to sum up, as a takeaway from all my experiences, going back to when I was like a 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid in Vietnam in the 60s and like in the early 60s, is that what we do, we make the same mistake over and over again, is we get involved in other people's problems that we don't understand. Absolutely. We don't understand the history. We don't understand the culture. It's like, I tell people, it's like if you hear your neighbors fighting next door and, they're fighting, every night you hear them screaming at one another and you're hearing, things breaking and so on, and then one day you go, okay, that's enough, and you go over and you knock on their door and basically think that you're going to get in the middle of it and straighten it out.
It's not
Any
not going to work.
Will tell you that's the most dangerous situation to ever get yourself in. And we do that all the time.
Right.
We never learn. We did
Ralph,
it in Iraq.
Well, unfortunately,
in Syria.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I hate to cut you off. I mean, you're one of my most favorite authors out there. I got to let you know. I got to bring you back on the show, most definitely. I mean, there's so much I didn't get to cover. But quick, Ralph, give our listening audience your website and where they can find you.
My website, it's ralphpezzullo.com, RalphPezzullo. Or, you can look up my books on Amazon, and, I write both fiction and nonfiction, and they all have sort of foreign themes to them, and, they're pretty edgy, and I think you'll be interested, yeah.
Amazing reads.
And, hey, Bruce, it's been a pleasure. I'll come back anytime.
Thank you so much, Ralph. We look forward to many, many more great interviews. Thank you.